One day after I am long gone, you will remember me and say, we should have stopped the nuclear program of Israel, abolished the Federal Reserve, and kicked all secret societies, occultists, usurpers, and Zionists out of our wonderful country to keep it that way. But it is never too late. Just remember that. John F. Kennedy. And I'm quite certain, shortly after saying this, he was murdered.
Represent today and what will happen to them in the end times?
Oh, so that's really easy. So Edom is Christendom. It is the implacable enemy of the Jewish people. That means it's not another religion that's just different than Judaism, like, I don't know, Buddhism or whatever, or Hinduism is different than Judaism. But in fact, Christendom is the implacable enemy of the Jewish people and the last kingdom. There are 4 enemy kingdoms of the nation of Israel that subjugated the Jewish people, and Edom is just the worst of everything, and that's Rome/Christianity.
Warning to New Russia. Taft commands Jewish efforts for liberated people. Ex-President Taft was a Freemason, by the way, applauded vigorously last night when Jacob H. Schiff, a Rothschild agent, at a dinner of the American Jewish Friends of Free Russia, praised Theodore Roosevelt for his efforts while president to bring the Russian autocracy to a realization of the wrongs committed against Jewish subjects. There was another outburst of applause when Mr. Schiff, introduced to the Toastmaster as a Russian revolutionist, asserted that, in his opinion, the abrogation of the treaty between the United States and Russia because of discrimination against American citizens of Jewish birth was the inspiration which is to a great extent ultimately brought about the overthrow of the Romanovs. Did you know that? America was an inspiration for that. Following the speeches, a resolution was adopted expressing confidence that Russia would not make a separate peace with Germany. I remember the efforts of Theodore Roosevelt, and be it ever to his credit, to bring the Russian autocracy to a realization of its wrongs, said Mr. Schiff. But I remember also that it was under the administration of our honored guest of this evening, ex-President Taft, that the treaty was abrogated. Some of us here have had some heavy moments since the beginning of the present war, feeling that the intrigues which had been organized for a restoration of that treaty might be successful. But I am thankful to say that when the subject was brought to the attention of President Wilson, he said, "Do not be afraid. The United States will never make another treaty with Russia so long as the present conditions last." Fortunately, those conditions do not now exist. The revolution has come. The Tsar's government has been swept away overnight, and the first act of the new government, God bless it, was to call home Russia exiles and to emancipate the Russian Jews. It's all about the Jews. All that happened in Russia was to kill off the Orthodox Church, kill off the Christians, and make it the homeland of Jews and their communist weapon. We do not know what may come hereafter, but this we do know, that never again will these rights be taken away. The Russian Jew has been liberated and will remain so forever. Did you know that was the purpose of that whole Russian Revolution? No. Nobody ever told you it was about the Jews. The dinner, which was held at the Hotel Astor, was attended by 800 guests, among them Henry Morgenthau, ex-ambassador to Turkey, Dr. B. Meltzer of the Rockefeller Institute, what a shock, Congressman Meyer London, Dr. Samuel Schulman, Berta Shafsky, unofficial representative in the United States of the new Russian government, Herman Bernstein, and Dr. Julius Halgren. See how many things are decided behind your back? Our government and the Jews making decisions for our future. Who made speeches? Edwin Markin and Robert Underwood Johnson read poems written by them on the Russian Revolution, probably praising the butchering of 60 million Christians. Mr. Taft praised the Jews for having retained their racial identity in the face of centuries of persecution and congratulated them on the Russian Revolution. The revolution opposing a separate peace with Germany will be cabled to Mr. Milikov, foreign minister in the Provisional Cabinet of Russia. This is in the New York Times. Never mind the persecution of all those innocent Russian civilians. They just butchered everybody. That doesn't matter. They're not Jewish, so, kill off those Christians. That's not a problem, and that's not historical, and we'll never talk about that again. We'll talk about Hitler, but we won't talk about Stalin or Lenin or Mao or any of the other Jewish people that killed off the Christians. That's not important. Joseph Stalin was born into a prominent Catholic family in Gori, Georgia. That's a part of Russia. His father was a priest and his mother was a devout Catholic. Stalin was educated by Capuchin priests as a boy and would later be accepted into Tiflis Seminary, a Jesuit institution. Despite the Jesuits' expulsion in 1820 by Alexander I, many Jesuits still remained within Russian territory and maintained control of several institutions, including Tiflis Seminary. Stalin himself substantiates this in his interview with journalist Emil Ludwig Cohen. Some historians propagate the theory that Stalin departed from the seminary shortly before graduating. That was just an attempt to cover up the fact that he indeed was a Jesuit priest that graduated after, I think it was 7 years at Tiflis. So, to pretend he left a week early, he wasn't one, is just ridiculous, But his first assignment was to go and take out the Romanovs, which he did. And he became the most brutal leader. He brutalized the Russians for decades. And only when he died did the brutality end, when Khrushchev stepped up. But it shows you also the reason why the Rothschilds, Nathan Rothschild, wanted to take out the Romanovs, because they banished the Jesuits, and Rothschilds were chief Jesuits. They're Jewish, right? They're Talmudic Jews, but they're like at the top of the Jesuit pyramid. And that tells you a lot of what you need to know. In his book, The Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn informed an incredulous world that the blood-maddened Jewish terrorists had murdered 66 million victims in Russia from 1918 to 1957. Solzhenitsyn cited Cheka Order No. 10, issued on January 8, 1921, to intensify the repression of the bourgeoisie. It was this order on which the establishment of the terrible Siberian camps, Koliman, and many others was based. Solzhenitsyn also brought to the Christian world the names of the mass murderers who ran these camps. All of them were Jews. Typical was one Lazar Kogan, who watched thousands of slave laborers die during his stint as boss of the White Sea Canal construction. He would sometimes remark to a new prisoner, "I believe that you personally were not guilty of anything. But as an educated person, you have to understand that social prophylaxis is widely being applied. Social prophylaxis was one of the vicious Jewish phrases which they used as euphemisms for their massacre of the Christians. Their victims, once they were consigned to the camps, were no longer considered human. As the Jews considered all others to be non-human, they were known simply by the nickname of zeks, slang for zeklaheni, which means prisoners in Russian. The Jews were given another opportunity to massacre helpless Christians during the Spanish Civil War. Ernest Elmhurst states in World Hoax, page 157, of no less significance was the transfer of Soviet Russia's former peace delegates at Geneva, the Jew Rosenberg, Moses Israelson, with his staff of 140 members of the Office of Ambassador to Spain in August of 1936. This cadre of highly trained specialists in torture and murder passed over a reign of terror, which was largely ignored by the rest of the world. When they do it, it's always ignored. Have you noticed that?
You know, we hear about Hitler all the time, constantly, and anti-Semitism. But there were 66 million Christians butchered in Russia and surrounding areas during this period. But where's the protection for the anti-Christian movement to protect the Christians so that never happens again? That was over 10 times the number of Jews were killed in Nazi Germany, and that is very disputed at this point. But you never hear about Mao, you never hear about Lenin and Trotsky, you never hear about Stalin and the butchering that he did. 60-some million people. And China, about the same. I mean, total, there's like 150, 60 million people butchered, probably mostly Christian. Okay? There were some Jews in there because, like Rothschild said, we'll butcher some of our own people because it will help our cause. And also they were pushing for Zionism, especially during Nazi Germany. Rothschild he helped set up Israel. He was pushing for the Zionist movement. So they were, they supposedly killing Jews so that they could get the Jews to fall in line with Zionism. And that opened the pathway to Palestine as well. So he's always, 5 miles ahead of everybody, planning and plotting. So much of this is all by design. But yeah, you never hear when it's Jewish leaders butchering Christians. That's a non-issue. That's not acceptable. I'm sick of hearing about anti-Semitism when really it's Christians that have been butchered for years, even during the Roman Catholic Inquisitions, which is, many people are now coming out showing that the Roman Catholic Church is controlled by the Jews. And also the Jesuits, clearly organized by the Jews and clearly have many of their members are Jewish. So that's a whole nother issue, especially Sephardic Jews. So here we sit, Christians, probably the most butchered people on the planet, but we're not supposed to say anything about the Jews, who actually did a lot of that butchering. Okay? That's not acceptable going forward, now that we know.
Ernest Hemingway and many others were themselves sympathetic to the communists, and they sought only to discredit the Spanish patriots, the fascists, as they contemptuously termed them. Well, that's why people like that are famous. They lift up their people. So that's all you ever hear, is their people. The Rosenberg murder teams were called World Revolutionary Movement Purification Squad. The purification consisted mainly of massacres of priests, nuns, choir boys, and women and children, as is so well described in the book of Esther, the occasion of the Jewish celebration of the Feast of Purim. Arthur Bryant, in his well-documented communist atrocities in Spain, tells of one murder squad which went to the Dominican convent in Barcelona and informed the Mother Superior that because of possible mob violence, the nuns should accompany the squad to a place of safety. They were taken to the suburbs and murdered. E.M. Godden, in Conflict in Spain, says on page 72, during the last week of July 1936, the bodies of nuns were exhumed from their graves and propped up outside the walls of their convents. Obscene and offensive placards were attached to their bodies. In Madrid, it was estimated that 1/10 of the population of Spain was murdered by the communist Jews by 1939. De Fontert's in Red Terror in Madrid tells how Cheka crews organized by Dimitrov and Rosenberg carried out a program of torture and murder so obscene it cannot be repeated or described. To further their world murder plan, the Jews have occasionally allowed a few of the numbers to be sacrificed. That was brought out as a meeting in Rothschild home in 1773. That's when they started the Illuminati. When it was stated, but it has paid us even though we have sacrificed many of our own people. Each victim on our side is worth 1,000 goyim. What the speaker meant was that if one Jew happens to be killed, he will be avenged by the death of 1,000 Christians, or cattle, as the Christians are derisively referred to by the Jewish cult. The speaker went on to point out to his rapt listeners that we are interested in just the opposite, in the diminution, the killing out of the goyim. The record of this meeting in Rothschild's house survived. Certainly no murder plan had ever previously been so meticulously laid out or so precisely put into operation. The figures are in, and they are indisputable. 50 million victims in World War I. 150 million victims in World War II. 66 million Christians murdered by Jewish fanatics in Russia since the success of the Bolshevik Revolution. That revolution was to destroy the Orthodox Church. That's why they did it. Plus, they wanted to get rid of the Romanovs. That was the side benefit. Many, if not the majority of these victims of Jewish terrorism were women and children. Millions of them perished of starvation and exposure in campaigns of communist expulsion from their homes. Typical was the expulsion of the Sudeten Germans from Czechoslovakia after World War II, during which more than 1 million Germans died, and the expulsion of the Germans from Poland, a horrifying trek which cost the lives of 2 million Germans. The Jews especially delighted in the deaths of these millions of Christian refugees, since the manner of their death fulfilled the most cherished doctrine of the Jewish hatred of all Christians, that non-Jews being considered as non-humans or cattle, in the Jewish term goyim, are not to be buried. This is a violation of Jewish law, which prohibits animals from being buried. They literally think of you as an animal. These million of Christian refugees lay where they fell during their terrible communist expulsions and never received Christian burials. Early in World War II, the communists delighted in the opportunity to indulge in their favorite sport of mass murder. During the first days of the war, 15,000 Polish officers who were the flower of the nation were captured. They were taken to 3 Jewish-operated communist camps, Starobiersk, Kozielsk, and Ostashkov. The Kozielsk camp was situated in the grounds of a former Orthodox monastery. 5 miles from the Kozielsk railway station in this camp, about 5,000 were sent away in small groups, the process continuing until April of 1940. Person Kieslev said that in the spring of 1940, prisoners were brought to Katyn Forest in 3 or 4 buses daily. From his house, he heard shots and shouts. It was rumored that 10,000 Poles were shot. And you know what? They're not nicer today. These people are evil, and they're plotting your destruction. Don't underestimate what they're capable of. It was rumored that 10,000 Poles were shot there. When the German army occupied the area in 1943, an investigation was begun. The final report of the German police, dated June 10, 1943, states that it was proved that without exception, death was caused by a shot in the back of the neck. The 7 mass graves of murdered Polish officers, which have been cleared, cover a relatively small area. From the translation of diaries of memoirs and other notes found with the bodies, it was proved that the officers who had been taken prisoner by the Soviet Army in 1939 were sent to various camps: Kozielsk, Starobilsk, Ostashkov, Poltavil, Boletov. Yeah, you can read it. The majority of those killed in Katyn Forest had been in the Kozielski camp from the end of March until the first day of May 1940. The prisoners from Kozielsk arrived by rail. The exact dates cannot be established. A few short intervals apart, a batch left almost every day. The number of prisoners varied between 100 and 300 persons. Thence, in the early morning, the prisoners proceeded in special lorries to the Caton Forest. There the officers were immediately shot, thrown into the waiting graves, and buried, as may be seen from the evidence of witness Cassiel, who has seen the ditches being prepared. That the shooting took place immediately after the arrival of a batch of prisoners is proved by witnesses who heard shots after every such arrival. They wanted to take them into the forest so nobody could witness it. There was no accumulation in the forest apart from the rest houses, which was a limited capacity. From the position of the bodies, it may be assumed that the majority were murdered outside the graves. Very many of the dead men had their hands tied behind their backs. The evidence of witnesses confirms that access to the forest was forbidden. Voss, Secretary of the Field Police, Professor Boots's report stated, documents found on the victims, identity cards, but not military passports, diaries, letters, postcards, calendars, photographs, drawings, etc., gave the names, ages, profession, origin, and family relations of the victims. Pathetic entries in the diaries testify to the treatment of the victims of the NKVD. The Caton case came before the Nuremberg Tribunal as part of the general trial of German war criminals, the Soviets having claimed this atrocity had been committed by the Germans. Although it was on the agenda, the Soviets omitted it from the judgment, nor was any Pole allowed to testify about it. See, it was rigged. Okay. Yeah, in the Nuremberg trials, everyone's like, oh, we need a No, most of those people, even if they were found guilty, if they did any prison time at all, it was almost none. They were released, except for a handful. It's a joke. You know, the whole Nuremberg trial thing was a joke. Most of them got away scot-free, and others were released when nobody was looking. They were released, so, it's just all the same people. Mr. G.F. Hudson wrote in the Quarterly International Affairs, the unquiet dead of Caton still walk the earth. In subsequent years, a number of congressmen have sought to reopen the case, including Honorable George A. Dondero, Honorable Ray Madden, and others. A U.S. Congressional Select Committee, July 2, 1952, reported that the committee unanimously agreed that the evidence dealing with the first phase of its investigation proves conclusively and irrevocably that the Soviet NKVD, the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, committed the massacre of Polish army officers in the Caton Forest near Smolensk, Russia, not later than the spring of 1940. The committee further concludes that the Soviets had plotted this criminal extermination of Poland's intellectual leadership as early as the fall of 1939, shortly after Russia's treacherous invasion of the Polish nation's borders. There can be no doubt that this massacre was a calculated plot to eliminate all Polish leaders who subsequently would have opposed the Soviets' plan for communizing Poland. They have no mercy, these people. The end of World War II gave the communists the opportunity to wreak revenge on all who had opposed them during the war. As a result, from 2 to 5 million victims were massacred by Jewish terrorists in France, Italy, Czechoslovakia, and other countries in which the communists were allowed by their allies to murder at will all anti-communists or fascists. So it's not just a facade that communists are Jewish. And the communism was created by Marx, and Marx was educated by the Jesuits. So the Jesuits are controlled by the Jews too. They are the synagogue of Satan. But, some people think they took over the Roman Catholic Church from the very inception. Others think later. I don't know. I hope to come across that information at some point so that we can know that information. But at some point they took full charge of that church. And the Jesuits are the satanic wing of it. There may have been some people in there, I think there were, like Pope Paul II. He was a great guy. He meant to do good. But they're dominated by the evil in that church. The Sunday Oklahoman shed some light on the horror, January 21st, 1973. Document tells Allied part in deaths of thousands. A former White House consultant has provided the Sunday Oklahoman with a secret document exposing the first time what appears to be Allied complicity in the deaths of thousands of unsuspecting liberated prisoners of war and displaced persons after World War II. Well, Rothschild bought out America at a point. Rockefeller and all those people were working for him. They were just Rothschild agents. So not hard to believe. The Jewish influence. The document, a 10-page British Army report, is believed to be part of voluminous Anglo-American files on the forcible repatriation to the Soviet Union of an estimated 2 to 5 million unwilling anti-communists between 1944 and 1948. The files, codenamed Operation Keelhaul, are still kept under tight security in London and Washington as virtually the last major secret of World War II. The secret British report summarizes one patriation operation in Italy in which Russian POWs and DIs were turned over to the Red Army, and almost certain execution after being duped by the British into believing they would be given asylum in the West. It tells the agony and horror experienced by the prisoners. So there's a lot of collusion going on behind the scenes. The Jews of each country were setting up all these people and just butchering them. And you just want to sit on your ass and just watch what's going on and watch videos and be entertained? Well, this is going on. Because it's no different today. It's just done differently now. The leading criminal in this mass execution of 2 to 5 million anti-communists, their mere crime was not liking communism. Who else? Our grinning Ike, head of the European sector for the Allied armies, or as you may know him, our former president, Eisenhower. So he was a criminal. He partook in this mass execution. The crime of Operation Keelhaul was not on the agenda at Nuremberg, so it was never discussed. It just happened. I wonder how much what else happened that we never, ever heard about. To finance the State of Israel, which was created as a direct result of the Jewish victory over the Christian nations in World War II, Jews who had committed all the atrocities now imposed enormous reparations, demands on the conquered German people. Yeah, so the Jews butchered them all, and now they want reparations. Right? It kind of sounds a lot like what goes on today, doesn't it? To date, they have extorted more than $35 billion from German workers, money which has been collected at the points of bayonets, not Jewish bayonets, but the bayonets of the American army. Yeah, our army working for the New World Order. Yeah. Don't thank them for your service. They're working for them, which has been maintained as an occupying force in West Germany for nearly 4 decades, solely to provide military power behind the puppet German government, which has as its primary function the furnishing of money for the parasitic state of Israel. Yeah. That's our military. We're giving $780 billion to our military so these people can dominate the world. Not for us, not for freedom, for their agenda. It's evil, and this has got to stop. Some 20 years after World War II, the Jews began to fear that scholars might focus on the terrible massacre of women and children during that war by armies directed by the Jews, the incineration of thousands of families by mass firebombings of the cities of Cologne, Hamburg, Berlin. And if the Caton butchery of Polish officers wasn't enough for you, to show you how evil these people were and still are, on April 10th, 2010, an aircraft operating Polish Air Force Flight 101 crashed near the Russian city of Smolensk, killing all 96 people on board. Among the victims were the president of Poland, Lech Kaczynski, and his wife Maria, the former president of Poland in exile, Ryszard Kazarowski, the chief of the Polish General Staff, and other senior Polish military officers, the president of the National Bank of Poland, Polish government officials, 18 members of the Polish parliament, senior members of the Polish clergy, and relatives of victims of the Katyn massacre. So a lot of important people. The group was arriving from Warsaw to attend an event commemorating the 70th anniversary of the massacre, which took place not far from Smolensk at Katyn. The pilots were attempting to land. They claim it was in thick fog, and that's why the crash happened. But here you have all these Polish officers once again in Russian territory. Putin was president at the time, and this plane crashed. Now, they have come up now and said the evidence is that the Russians were involved in the crash. So, I mean, they can come back up later and say anything they want to excuse the crash away. But the fact is, these same country coming to commemorate their fallen officers at the hands of the Russians, murdering them in Katyn Forest, 22,000 of their top officials, their military officials. Here they go to commemorate it, and they're butchered once again. 98 people this time. But I mean, literally, the top officials of the government shot down in Russia. I remember this. I remember when it happened, and there was, there's a lot of covering up, very little talk about it. So I believe, definitely, they were shot down. How evil is that? That they still have no remorse for butchering 22,000 of their top officials, putting bullets in their head one after the next. The Nazis wouldn't even do something like that. They disavowed it completely. In fact, they uncovered it. But this happened. One article from the Observer.com says, to make matters even more painful, President Kaczynski and his entourage died en route to a commemoration at Katyn, the forest in western Russia, where in the spring of 1940, Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, murdered 22,000 Polish military officers captured by the Soviets when they carved up Poland with Adolf Hitler the previous September. Here, Moscow murdered Poland's elite, covered up by the Kremlin until after the Cold War, with help from the incurious West. Yeah, America didn't help with this. They covered it up too. Katyn lingers as an unhealed wound in the Polish psyche. The sudden death of so much of the country's leadership on the way to that site of national martyrdom was too much for some Poles to bear. From the outset, right-wing allies of the fallen president smelled a rat. A Russian rat. That is, Poles know their neighbor well, and Kaczynski had no illusions about Vladimir Putin's thuggish regime. It seemed beyond suspicious that Poland's government died in a disaster on Russian soil, especially when they're going to commemorate such a horrible event. You think there would be a little guilt involved on the... No, they showed them once again what they're made of. Evil. Particularly when the Kremlin is led by a man who came of age in the KGB, the very same people who executed and covered up the Katyn massacre. Putin was actually on the streets. He was one of those people working for the KGB, following people around, secret police, tracking people down. He is not a good guy. And the fact that we have people now like Alex Jones and Trump trying to tell you that he's a good guy and he's on our side and trying to get us to rush into his arms. No. This man was brainwashed from a child. He's evil. This is a game they're playing to get us to think it's okay for Putin to do bricks and, destroy our dollar, that's a good thing. That's the destruction of America. And that he's safe and he's good and we can trust it. No, this is the kind of thing he does. He literally butchered these people again. When he had a chance to make it right, instead he slapped them in the face again and stuck a knife in their back. That is so evil. It's beyond understanding. They want to blame this on pilot error and, oh, it's the weather, but I remember when it happened. It was covered up, there was little discussion about it, and it was very suspicious. Most investigators concurred with the official assessments in 2013. The Canadian TV show Mayday ran an episode explaining the crash, yet Russian conduct surrounding the disaster raised doubts in many minds. Moscow promised full cooperation, but did not deliver. 8 years later, the crash wreckage has not been handed over to Poland, so they didn't even give them the plane. Making proper investigation, so we're just going by Russia's say-so here. Poland never got the plane to examine. And then, of course, we sent, I'm sure everyone sent officials in. Well, we know about officials, right? Hand-picked. Worse, dead bodies were robbed of possessions while under guard by the Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB. Well, the FSB reportedly stole NATO secrets, including classified communication protocols from the corpses of Polish military officers. These people are still dirty as hell. Can't be trusted, evil, vile. Jewish communism, Talmudism is still very much alive in Russia. Likely the Rothschild influence. Even more embarrassingly, the Kremlin was remarkably slipshod in its handling of the dead. Sent home in sealed coffins, many of the bodies had been swapped or misidentified in 24 cases of re-examination in 2016. Half of the coffins opened contained the wrong remains. Even the coffin of President Kaczynski included the remains of 2 other victims. Such carelessness inevitably led to questions about what else the Russians had mishandled or worse. It just shows a total lack of regard, a total disrespect. And we think we can trust these people. You've got to be kidding. To many polls, this all pointed to a conspiracy, a secret Russian hand behind the disaster. Books and even movies appeared that posited various versions of what critics have dismissed as conspiracy theory. Well, we all know about that, don't we? When the right-wing Law and Justice Party came to power in the late 2015, guided by Jaroslaw Kaczynski, the fallen president's identical twin brother, it pledged to get to the bottom of the Smolensk mystery. Defense Minister Masiewicz took the lead and denounced the previous government's account of the disaster as a whitewash, secretly coordinated with Moscow. Masiewicz promised a fresh look at Smolensk based on new evidence that he insisted had been suppressed by the previous center-right Polish government. As Masiewicz told me a few months ago of Smolensk, what a great shock this was for everyone in Poland, no matter their views on this tragedy. He had promised our report on the tragedy, which will reveal how it happened. This is an international investigation. It is overdue. The 8th anniversary of the disaster came last month, but by that time, he was no longer Warsaw's defense minister, so he didn't deliver either. However, the report in synopsis and full formats appeared last month, as promised, and charged that the disaster was caused by multiple explosions aboard the plane. So there's explosions. So bombs were planted prior to its collision with the ground. This, in other words, was no accident, and the Russians were behind it. Although this report has predictably been dismissed by opponents as, you guessed it, conspiracy theory, it merits examination. For one, the report involved Frank Taylor, a veteran British air crash investigator of considerable renown. For decades, Taylor has unraveled aviation mysteries at home and abroad, including the 1988 Lockerbie terrorist attack on Pan Am 103. Notably, Taylor led the re-examination of the 1980 Ustica disaster, the loss of an Italian DC-9 that claimed 81 lives. Multiple Italian investigations concluded that the airline was shot down in secret air battle over the Mediterranean between NATO and Libya. Taylor determined that there was a zero basis for this scenario and instead found clear evidence of a bomb planted on the doomed DC-9, a scientifically sound verdict that was ignored in Rome for political reasons. This depressing saga is the subject of a recent Mayday episode. In other words, Taylor is no conspiracy theorist and has deeply troubling comments on Smolensk deserves to be taken seriously. This February, he dismissed the official verdict of the Russian and Polish inquiries as a politically convenient fantasy, stating, "There is no doubt there were explosions on board before the aircraft hit the ground." In a subsequent interview, Taylor explained, "There is strong evidence that a few seconds later, on the left side of the fuselage, just forward of the wing, was blown out and driven hard into the ground by another explosion in the fuselage." He added that the Kremlin investigation was a fraud. Russian politicians took over the investigation, preventing the professional investigator from taking control of the accident site, from completing the full investigation, including a full reconstruction of the wreckage, and from writing the final accident report. Given Taylor's status as a respected air crash investigator, the Smolensk disaster needs thorough reinvestigation by experienced third parties, neither Polish nor Russian. In truth, Western intelligence has had grave doubts about the official version of Smolensk from the outset. A senior Polish security official bluntly informed me, "Of course Warsaw knew the truth," meaning the previous government sought to keep peace with Putin by going along with the Russian version of the disaster. He continued, "What were they supposed to do? Do you think NATO would really go to war with Russia for Poland over Smolensk?" And see, this is really the whole key point. When you have people that evil, like Putin and the rest of the people out there, and now we have people in our government just as evil, you can have no justice. They have no honor. They have no decency. They cannot be trusted. And now we have people telling us that Putin is a wonderful person and he wants freedom and he wants religion and Christianity. No, it's all a lie. It's all a fake out. It's a fake out, fake out, fake out to make you think it's okay that he destroys our dollar through BRICS, that he leads this other group. Again, BRICS was set up to destroy America. Why do you think they took all of our jobs overseas? That was part of the setup. And they were sent to China and India, which is part of BRICS, to empower them and weaken us. And that's exactly what it's done. It stole our manufacturing. And now a lot of Americans can't get jobs. So we need to understand the play that is being rolled out before us. It's all a fraud. We need to get up and take our country back and insist that these foreign influences, Israel and all of these influences that are buying out our government, buying out our filthy politicians, needs to end, and there needs to be prison sentences for this and probably treason charges, because it's gone too far. We are all at risk because evil, great evil, has taken over our government. They bought it out, and we need to get it back. And you can read article after article about all the Jews that were persecuted, pogromed in Russia during the Revolution and the Civil War. And they were. You don't hear so much about the Christians that were butchered across the nation. No, that's more of a secret. But remember one thing. Rothschild is the one who wanted to take out the Romanovs and take control of Russia with his Marxism and communism. And he is the one in control of the killing of these Jews. So what does that mean? That means, well, he's a Talmudic Jew, synagogue of Satan. So the Jews he was butchering, and he may have butchered some of their own Jews, because as he said earlier, it's worth it. The ends justifies the means. We will get more Christians and Goyim if we take out a few of our people. But also, looks to me like he was trying to remove the real Jews, the ones that did not turn their back on God, Jesus and Moses, trying to remove them because they would not go along. And also, along the way, he's trying to create Zionism, and he's taking out Jews to help promote that concept. It went on more during Hitler, but it was starting to progress during these times. So remember, when you hear about all the Jews being persecuted everywhere, these people were behind it. So it wasn't you. I mean, they're pointing at you and saying you are an anti-Semite. No, they're the anti-real Jews. They are the synagogue of Satan. They took out the real Jews, the ones that actually followed God and did not turn their back on him. That's a really important point that nobody seems to understand.